All right, let's begin. My name is Lisa Osipenko and I head Consilium Scientific. Today I'm very pleased to welcome Jeanne Lenzer and Shannon Brownlee, who are investigative journalists, and they've conducted a fantastically interesting investigation, which is very topical for Consilium. This is exactly what we as an organization are looking into, and it talks about integrity of clinical research. So without detailed introductions, I would like to give a word to Jeanne to introduce their research on FDA-approved but ineffective drugs. So Jeanne, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lisa. So Shannon and I have been reporting on one disaster after another in the medical world, and we got tired of reporting everything as a one-off. But we're going to start with a one-off and a story that is part of why we decided to look into the bigger picture that links all these disasters. Why do they keep happening? And so the story we want to tell you today is about this woman named Monique, and she and her husband, well, not her, but her husband asked that only first names be used. So Monique lived in the outskirts of Paris with her husband, Richard, and she was in her late 60s when she started having some memory problems. And the new Alzheimer's drugs, as you all know, is they're approved for only the earliest of Alzheimer's symptoms. So these are people who might have some degree of forgetfulness. They might not even have full-blown Alzheimer's at all, just early memory loss, and basically be quite functional. And she had these memory problems, so she went to a doctor in Paris, and he said, we have a study ongoing, and it was of Lecanemab or Leqembi. And after her 11th infusion of Leqembi, she suddenly became dramatically confused and started having seizures. And her seizures were so bad, they had to keep her in the hospital for months because one thing led to another. It was just a cascade of disasters where she became so disoriented that she fell, broke her spine. I think she became septic. I don't remember all the details, but it was horrific enough that she was in ICU for a long time. And when they finally let Richard in to see her, and I'm going to read what he said she was delirious, hallucinating, pulling on her medical equipment, her limbs tied to the bed, suffering, not recognizing us. And once she was at home, she descended rapidly into complete dementia. And he said the few moments when she's lucid are actually worse in a different way because she's semi-aware of her situation. So that set Shannon and I off onto this journey to figure out, why do these bad drug disasters keep happening? What links them? And we decided to create a database, and Shannon will take it from there.
Thanks, Jeanne. And thanks to Consilium for having us. I am trying to move my slide forward. Here we go. So the work that we're going to be talking about is two stories so far, and we have a third story in the work. The first two stories have been published in The Lever, which is an online outlet, media outlet. And this is the second. You're looking at the headline of the second story, but if you go to Lever News and Google our names or one of our names and Alzheimer's, you can find the Alzheimer's story. And then this is the second story, which I'll talk about a little bit more now. So we did a deep dive investigation into the Alzheimer's story. And what we found was that there was more to the story than what had appeared in the papers about Aduhelm. You may have heard of all of the scandal around the approval of Aducanumab, Aduhelm. This was a drug that when they first submitted their two trials to the FDA rejected the drug because the two trials conflicted, for starters. For another thing, one of the trials found absolutely no benefit, and the other trial found some slight benefit. And the FDA said no. And so an FDA official named Billy Dunn, who was the head of the neurology division at the FDA, said, kind of like this, hey, go ahead and resubmit, only ask for an accelerated approval. which meant that they were going to be allowed to submit this application on the basis of a surrogate endpoint. So rather than having clinical endpoint of Alzheimer's getting better or slowing down, the dementia slowing down, they were able to apply on the basis of whether or not the drug removed amyloid from the brain, which many of you know. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jeanne.
Well, this was a stunning reversal, just so we emphasize that point that, usually you use a surrogate to say, should we go on to see if there's a clinical benefit? And then you look for the clinical benefit. They already had the answer.
They already knew they didn't have a clinical benefit.
Clinical. So let's reverse. Let's go backwards and look for a surrogate.
Right. So the scandal sort of revolved around the fact that Billy Dunn had done this whole backdoor thing. He'd had all these unofficial meetings with the companies, and it was two companies, Biogen and Eisai. And the drug gets approved in June of 2021, and it's a big scandal. There's a congressional investigation, et cetera, et cetera. Congress slaps the FDA on the wrist, and the FDA promises to do better. And then it proceeds to approve the next two drugs, Lecanemab and Donanemab. And the really important thing about these drugs we found in our investigation was the balance of harms and benefits wasn't in the favor of the patient. So the harms, as the example of Monique demonstrated, was seizures, brain swelling, which caused seizures, falls, possibly due to brain bleeds, hemorrhagic strokes effectively, and brain swelling. So these were just some of the side effects. There were a lot of other side effects. And these side effects occurred in patients in pretty high rates.
Yeah.
But what was most interesting to us about these drugs is, and one of the reasons that some of these side effects occurred was, as one researcher said to us, is when you remove amyloid from the brain, the amyloid plaques are actually integrated into the blood vessels. And he was a pathologist. He was a neurological pathologist at Northwestern University, and he had looked at the brains of a couple of patients, and he said their brains were an absolute mess. They had lesions scattered throughout their brains. It wasn't like a hemorrhagic stroke in one place. It was little strokes all over. And he said, when you take amyloid out, it can be like tearing a scab off of a wound. So it was making the blood vessels very leaky. But what we got interested in is, well, did these drugs work? And there's a lot in the press about how each of the drugs is anywhere from 27 to 32% more effective than placebo. But it turns out that is a relative risk claim. And the absolute efficacy compared to placebo was anywhere from 1.5 to 1.7 points difference on an 18-point questionnaire. In other words, the difference between patients on the drug and patients on the placebo was so negligible that patients and their families and even their doctors could not tell that they were on the drug or on the placebo. Yet these drugs got approved. So we detailed all of the processes, the steps that were involved in these Alzheimer's approvals, and tried to describe what the science was behind them, and why there was reason to doubt that they worked at all, and why there's reason to worry about the amyloid hypothesis itself, which is what has driven many, many, many drugs to be developed. Most of them have failed. They either didn't work at all, or they actually harmed patients terribly, or both. And now these three drugs are now approved. They're on the market, except Aduhelm has been now since withdrawn from the market for financial reasons, according to Eisai and Biogen. So we said, okay, there's this example. This is yet another example of problematic drugs that end up getting approved. But how often does it really happen? Now, it turns out we started this project about 3 years ago when we were teaching a graduate level class in journalism in New York. And we created a database mostly because we thought it would be a great teaching tool for these students to learn how to do medical investigative reporting. But then we got deeper and deeper into the database, as we do, and found that there was probably a really important story there. So let me tell you a little bit about this database. So the database was, and actually, Jeanne, I was going to share the database, but I don't actually know how to do that at the moment. So we created this database, and it included all new molecular entities approved from January 2013 through December 2022 by the FDA. That amounted to 429 different drugs, including biologics and vaccines. We just called everything a drug. And what we did is we found 4 experts. And what those experts, we wanted them to do was to look at the evidence that the FDA used in making the approval. What kind of evidence did they use? They weren't supposed to do a full appraisal of the studies, but they needed to look at what the FDA used.
Well,
and
let me just say
go
here,
ahead.
Well, that we had learned from our reporting before, as the Alzheimer's is just one of many examples that Shannon and I have covered, where the weak spot was in the FDA approval. And clearly with the new Alzheimer's drugs, surrogate endpoints were one of them. So we wanted to look at what the FDA itself said were important, were the critical things to allow them to approve drugs. So we created this database with 4 different categories, and Shannon will just...
Right. So the analysis criteria that our 4 experts were to use in looking at each drug, and they had to look through a wide variety of sources to be able to find this out. You know, they had to look at clinicaltrials.gov, they had to look at FDA briefing documents, they had to look at a variety of places, but they were tasked with find out what the FDA used to make this approval and assess whether or not the drug satisfied all 4 of these foundational criteria. So did the trial or trials, as they are supposed to do, have a control group? Did the trial was it replicated? Did they do more than one that came out with a positive result? Were the trials blinded? And did they use a clinical endpoint? And this is a somewhat controversial issue because people are increasingly willing to believe that surrogate endpoints are a perfectly fine way to assess whether or not drugs actually work or not. But there are lots and lots of reasons to think that surrogate endpoints may not be the best way to know whether or not a drug actually will do something that a patient cares about. Living longer, not going to the hospital, not being disabled, and not dying prematurely.
Yeah, and I'd add that even so-called validated clinical endpoints, it's a real problem because now drugs get on the market, as everybody here knows. I see we've got a lot of people already know a lot of the stuff we're talking about, but if you test a new drug and it's, blood sugar or hemoglobin A1C is supposed to be this great surrogate endpoint, but we've already seen new diabetes drugs that cause congestive heart failure. So since surrogate endpoints can't tell us anything about harms and can only tell us about efficacy, we think that there should be a clinical outcome to compare. Is this drug worth it? Is it even as good as other drugs that are already on the market? Or are you just passing the placebo mark, which is all they have to do?
Right. And as it happens, the FDA has regulations around what are the criteria they're supposed to use. Now, there are actually 7 criteria that they use, but these are the 4 foundational criteria. And clinical endpoint, a clinically meaningful endpoint, is not only written into the regs, but it's also in case law. So the FDA is supposed to look at whether or not a drug produces a clinically meaningful effect for patients. So here are some of the results that we found. Those are the 4 criteria. They looked at the 429 drugs, and a really important note here. When there was a shred of doubt, was it really a blinded study? Sometimes you can't tell. Was it really replicated? Sometimes it's really hard to know. Their task was to err on the side of giving the benefit of the doubt. In other words, if they thought that it hadn't really been blinded, but there was some tiny reason to think maybe it had, they said, yes, it's been blinded.
Well,
So
actually, it wasn't just if they thought. If they saw one study was blinded, but the other study was
right,
not blinded, they were told, mark it as blinded, even though
mark them as
one of them
blinded.
was not.
Right,
And it was that same way with each outcome, a
right,
control group, you know, even if it was a historical control group, which they're not supposed to do, the FDA
right,
itself says is not really proper.
right,
Then we said, yeah, they had a control group.
right. So we gave it the benefit of the doubt. So what the numbers I'm going to give you next are really minimal numbers in many ways. So what we found was 73% of drugs approved by the FDA over that 10-year period didn't meet the agency's own 4 foundational standards for efficacy. More than half get approved on preliminary data, which is surrogate endpoints. 55 of the 429 met only one of the 4 standards, and 39 met none of the standards.
And for
So there was
cancer
no
drugs,
control group, no blinding, no replication,
right?
and no clinical endpoint. It's just like, oh,
Unbelievable.
then how do you know the drug works? Well, we just know.
I just got an email
So,
today from a woman who wanted to know about a drug her husband was put on, Welireg, and I checked it and 0. It, just as Shannon said,
yeah,
no control
yeah,
group, no
yeah,
replication, no blinding, and no clinical outcome, and yet this drug is being used.
yeah.
For
And
cancer drugs,
cancer drugs are the worst. Sorry, go
the
ahead, Jeanne.
worst.
Oh
2
my
point,
goodness.
yeah, only 2.4% of the 123 cancer drugs approved during that 10-year period met all 4 of the FDA's scientific criteria. 29 drugs, or 23%, met none. Just like that drug I just mentioned.
Yep.
Not
And
one single standard.
81% were approved based on a surrogate endpoint.
Yeah.
And cancer drugs are particularly problematic in terms of being approved on surrogate endpoints, because we know from lots of studies that many cancer drugs that are approved on the basis of a surrogate, when they are then later retested looking for a clinical endpoint, they don't work. They don't have a clinical endpoint. And yet, interestingly, the FDA lets those drugs stay on the market often, and has let them stay on the market. And they have a wonderful term for it. It's called dangling approvals. In other words, this drug's just kind of hanging out in midair, and we don't have a whole lot of evidence that it actually works, but we're not going to yank the approval.
Yeah, these
At
are
least
drugs that
not
got
yet.
approved based on a surrogate endpoint. They said,
Right.
okay, you have to prove the drug works after it's on the market, which we all know is virtually impossible, because not totally impossible, but close to it, because patients don't want to take a drug if it's already on the market in an experimental study, because their attitude is, but it's the FDA approved it, therefore I think it's good and I want to take it. And they also do things like now they're using extension phases. Well, you've already kicked out all the people who are going to die and have terrible effects. They make it to the extension phase and you use them because they're a winning group. I mean, it's so bad what they're doing. But this dangling approval thing is, yeah, we approved it based on a surrogate endpoint. Now it's on the market. We get that post-market study that we required to see that it actually works. Gee whiz, it doesn't work. Oh, okay, leave it on the market. And that's a dangling
Well,
approval.
and the
So that's
rationale
when
for
they,
that is
no, that's
just wonderful. It is, just because a drug fails
right,
in its
right.
clinical trials doesn't mean it doesn't work, which is true. But what it does mean is that the FDA is approving drugs in the we don't know stage. In the we don't know if this drug works, but we're going to put it out on the market anyway and hope that it works. And people are going to pay for it, and insurers are going to pay for it. The federal government is going to pay for it. And we're just going to hope that it works. And, and some drugs actually that are approved on surrogates do turn out to have clinical efficacy.
Yeah, but
But
this whole
many
idea
cancer drugs do not.
the whole idea used to be that you were supposed to approve it, you were supposed to show that a drug worked before you put it on the market. And this is a seismic shift where no
Yes.
longer are we showing that drugs work before you put them on the market. The idea is, oh, okay, we'll show it after they're on the market. And that's happened very quietly without people realizing that that's what's going on.
Well, including physicians and
Yeah,
including members of Congress who are helping make
absolutely.
the rules that govern what the FDA does. So we then ask, well, how did this happen? How did this come about? So it turns out that it really happened during the Reagan deregulation era, when the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, in the Reagan White House, didn't want to increase any government funding, and they did not want to increase the FDA's funding, and they kept holding the line and saying, nope, no more money for the FDA, no more money for the FDA. And this was at a time when the FDA really wasn't very well, it didn't really have computers. It was using fax. It was, it was pretty antiquated, even though those things were already available at that point. And computers widely available? I guess they were to some degree. Yes, they were. It's really a sign of how old you are when you can remember when you used your first computer. And that was in the 80s. And so what happened in the 1980s was AIDS was happening. And AIDS activists were really very and legitimately upset at how long the FDA was taking in reviewing drugs. Drugs were sitting on reviewers' desks for as long as 3 years before the reviewer would say, yes, this drug, should be approved, or no, this drug doesn't have any evidence that it works and it shouldn't be approved. And at that time, the pharmaceutical industry had been resisting some legislation that had been kicking around Congress for a few years. And this legislation was this idea that user fees, that the pharmaceutical industry would pay user fees as a way of bolstering the FDA's budget. And the industry didn't want to pay user fees. They looked at this FDA that was taking so long, and they just thought that users' fees were just going to cost them more money. But eventually they were persuaded that, in fact, the amount they would spend on user fees was far less than the amount they were losing in drugs sitting on a reviewer's desk. So the AIDS activists and the pharmaceutical industry sat down with the FDA and sat down with Congress, and they hammered out a way to make sure that drugs got approved faster and that the pharmaceutical industry would start paying user fees. And most of you probably know what this is called. It's called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or PDUFA. And PDUFA was enacted in 1982. And at the time, it made up a 1992, I'm sorry. It made up a pretty small 10% of the FDA's budget for approving drugs, but it allowed the FDA to hire 200 new reviewers. It allowed it to computerize. It allowed, those fees were actually very helpful, and it speeded up approvals. But written into the law was the very beginning of the loosening of those standards, those 4 foundational standards that are now being ignored pretty much a great deal of the time. So the first thing that came in was the use of surrogate endpoints as a result of that first PDUFA that was passed. And it became quite routine after that. And so what we saw was accelerated approvals, a lot of accelerated approvals where drugs could apply to be given this status, and that would allow them to then say, look at a surrogate endpoint, and then we'll prove later after the drug's on the market that it actually works. There was a breakthrough designation that eventually came in with a subsequent reauthorization of PDUFA, and this was drugs that were for conditions that didn't have any other real option. And so a drug was called a breakthrough if it was for a condition that didn't have other options, and that it was very promising. It looked like there was lots of data to say it was going to be a really great drug. And then the use of surrogate endpoints became very, very common. So every 5 years, PDUFA is reauthorized. And what that has done is it gives the pharmaceutical industry an opportunity to lobby Congress, and it lobbies very, very hard. In the last run up to the last PDUFA, PDUFA 4, the industry had something like 889 lobbyists, which is 3 lobbyists for every member of Congress, or 2 lobbyists for every member of Congress. And it lobbies very hard for loosening of the scientific rules so that they can get drugs approved faster and faster and faster. They meet multiple times with the FDA. And meanwhile, organizations that are trying to sort of say, no, let's keep sticking to the science, like Public Citizen, like the Yale Group for Good Regulation, they're allowed to meet very, very few times. So PDUFA has had this sort of multiple effects in giving the industry a lot of control over how drugs end up getting approved.
And I want to mention one thing about the breakthrough drugs. What most people don't realize, and a couple people here in the audience I know have written about breakthrough drugs, including Joel Lexton, who just sent a recent review. But the designation of breakthrough is awarded long before they have any clinical data. You know, this is based on a conceptually, we believe this is going to be a breakthrough. And I think what it was either Joel, maybe he'll speak up eventually, but I think 1 in 4 breakthrough drugs, only 1 in 4 showed to provide any significant benefit.
Right. And this is quite problematic because if the word breakthrough is used with the public, they think it's really a breakthrough, that this is really a great drug.
Yeah.
I
mean, doctors want to prescribe it because it's a breakthrough.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so the terms are really quite powerful. It's like there's a very common surrogate endpoint used in cancer, which is progression-free survival.
Oh, that's really
which is
impressive.
A way of it, and yeah, it sounds very impressive.
It sounds,
oh yeah, well the tumor's not getting bigger, and therefore I'm, this is good news. I'm going to live longer. And it turns out that it often has no relationship to whether or not the patient is going to survive longer or not.
In fact,
and so the terminology is important.
We tell the story of one cancer drug, Copitra, which had improved progression-free survival but killed patients 11 months faster. So, but both the public and doctors are fooled by these phrases.
Yeah. So this is a reiteration of what Jeanne said earlier, that before PDUFA, the general feeling, and this is not universal, it wasn't true universally, but generally, the FDA wanted companies to prove that their drugs worked before they were allowed on the market. And after PDUFA, increasingly, they've been able to prove drugs work after they're on the market, if they ever show that they actually work. We have one example of a drug called Elmeron, and Jeanne, I'm going to get all the numbers wrong, so you have to remember the numbers. But Elmeron was approved in the 1990s, and this is a drug for interstitial cystitis, a very painful bladder condition, and it was approved on the basis of a trial that was conducted at 7 different sites. And 6 of those sites found no efficacy, but 1 site did. And that was the site that was run by the person who owned the patent to the drug and who had licensed the drug to a company called Baxter Pharmaceutical.
And the FDA noticed this, and the FDA refused to approve it 4 times. And they kept saying, come back to us with evidence without the guy who owns the patent. Give us some real evidence. Give us a randomized control trial, and we'll look at it. And the company literally said, this is in the pages of the briefing documents, said no. And then they said,
no, we're not doing a trial.
Yeah, this is back in 1990 something. And they said, 96. But we'll make you a deal. If you'll approve it now, we'll show it works afterwards. Was 2015 when the study was finally conducted. I think it was 19 years after that the FDA approved it, made the deal with the company. And 19 years later, they conducted the randomized control trial and found that it had absolutely no effect. It was as good as placebo. And that was in 2015. So 10 years after that study, it's still on the market. And that was the only real study of the drug.
And, so this is the situation where, and the FDA is understandably hesitant to pull approval of a drug. And this has to do with the history of how often it's done it, when it's done it. And so the episode that really has stuck with the FDA, and this is about culture as much as it is about science, was this drug Avastin that was a cancer drug that's used for quite a few cancers now, and it's effective for a number of cancers, but it was being used for metastatic breast cancer, and the company got the approval on the basis of progression-free survival, a surrogate endpoint, and said this was Genentech, and said they would do the trials. They would do the trials after it went to market. So it goes to market, And lo and behold, they do a number of trials, and none of them show that it works, and it actually decreases quality of life. It had really significant side effects, including cardiac side effects, et cetera. And so the FDA held a hearing, and the company, Genentech, brought in a lot of patients to this hearing who claimed that the drug absolutely saved their lives. One does wonder about the people that it killed who couldn't be at the hearing, but there was enormous pressure put on the FDA, and eventually they pulled the approval, and the drug was withdrawn for breast cancer. But the experience of doing that was so bruising for the FDA that they continued to call it Armageddon for another 20 years. And it would take them about 15 years, was it 15 or 20, before they then pulled one more drug's approval. So the agency has become extremely wary about pulling approvals. And companies know that. And so companies often don't do the trials that they promised that they would. And so then they'll get a starchy letter from the FDA that says, where's the trial? And then a couple of years will go by, and then there will be another letter saying, where's the trial? And the trial doesn't materialize.
If there's a letter.
Yes, if there's even a letter, exactly. And the really deep reason that this is happening is something that John Hansen at Harvard called deep capture. And he called it deep capture when he was referring to the tobacco industry. And what he was talking about vis-a-vis the tobacco industry is that the industry managed to control the narrative in many, many different venues. It was able to control the narrative at Congress. It was able to control the narrative at the FDA, and it was definitely able to control the narrative in the public's eye by sowing doubt about what effect smoking actually had on rates of lung cancer. So you may remember the Tobacco Institute, which was this so-called research institute that was doing research around smoking, and it was invariably finding that smoking was not nearly as harmful as independent researchers were finding, and that secondhand smoke didn't do anything, et cetera, et cetera. And so John Hansen, who studied the tobacco industry's tactics, called it deep capture because it's sort of a 360-degree effort to really be able to control what happens to your product. And the drug industry makes tobacco look like a bunch of amateurs. Deep capture in the drug industry is truly extraordinary. So the industry is the biggest donor to campaign chests for members of Congress. It has an army of lobbyists. It spends more than any other single industry in the United States in lobbying Congress by a lot.
That includes big oil, finance, banks.
Oh yeah. In fact, big oil and it's basically more than the next three combined. It spends more than the next three combined. And of course, I can't remember exactly how much it spends per year, but it's a lot of money. But it actually spends even more on patient advocacy groups. And this is something that's not very well recognized. Patient advocacy groups have grown increasingly powerful in terms of approvals at the FDA. The FDA has incorporated patient voices more and more and more into the process of making approvals, which in many ways is a good thing because medicine often doesn't really acknowledge what matters to patients. And so patient advocates are able to say, these are the things that matter. These are the things that bother us about our disease. These are the things that we don't like about drugs. And those things are very, very important. And drug companies have started listening to patients as well. But to spend $6 billion over a decade and basically devote on average 6 full-time equivalent employees to your relationships with patient advocacy groups, this is what the industry does, and it does that because it affects their bottom line. And the main way, there are 2 ways that it affects their bottom line. Number one, patient advocacy groups are seen by the public and often by the press as being the voice of patients.
as if
even
they're
though the
independent.
presidents of
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
the presidents of these organizations are not patients. They're professional CEOs, and they make six-figure salaries, but they are seen as the voice, the sort of grassroots voice of patients. And so patient advocacy groups have been able to effectively serve as covert marketers for the industry. They have gotten out these ideas like new drugs are always better than old drugs, that the expense of new drugs is worth it because these drugs are so great. They have very clearly been, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on which organization it is, been co-opted into voicing industry messages. But the other way that they're really, really important is they have enormous power at the FDA, enormous power at the FDA. And they do this in a number of ways. If people want to talk about it, we can certainly do that. But the next thing that the industry has done is it has really and truly corrupted the research enterprise. And this, I know, is one of the main interests of the Consilium group. And I know you have talked about these issues in other seminars. But it's very complicated. It has many facets, but so much of clinical research has been biased by the industry and its efforts. It pays for an enormous amount of medical education, and so it has biased medical education as well. It uses, in direct-to-consumer advertising, it uses celebrity spokespeople as a way of having them be covert marketers, in effect. They have sock puppets on social media. They now, because of PDUFA, are allowed to have multiple meetings with FDA officials, and so these relationships that are developed with FDA officials turn out to be very, very important. And then there's the revolving door at the FDA. The last 10 of 11 commissioners have had financial conflicts of interest with the industry. Many of them have gone on to work for industry. People in managerial positions at the FDA end up going to work for industry. And the revolving door goes the other way, where people who are from industry go to work for the FDA and then cycle out again and go back to work for industry. And so, for example, Patrizia Cavazzoni, who was the past head of the Center for Drugs and oversaw the approval of the Alzheimer's drugs, came from Pfizer, oversaw the approval of the Alzheimer's drugs, had a number of effects on various ways that the agency approves drugs, including pushing for not letting advisory committees have a vote. And then she cycled out again and is now the chief medical officer at Pfizer. So this revolving door spins and spins, and it spins in both directions. So we want to leave you, with a quote from a consultant that really speaks very directly to the ways that the culture at the FDA has really been powerfully affected by relationships. And it doesn't seem like that should be what sways people. They're supposed to be basing this on science. But in fact, the relationships that develop because the industry has so many meetings with officials at the FDA and is allowed to have these meetings. I mean, they're not held at arm's length. And this is what a consultant is saying to CEOs at drug companies. And he uses examples. He uses great examples. He uses examples of 5 different drugs that got approved despite having 0 positive evidence.
We're saving
and
that.
Yes, and 10 other drugs that had conflicting evidence.
This will be coming out in our next article, so we're going to save this.
Yes. So with that, thank you so much. I think we've left plenty of time for questions and discussion, and I know that the people here have lots to say on their own, and so, you don't need to ask us questions necessarily. You should probably be asking each other questions, but we welcome corresponding with anybody who is interested. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Yes, thank you so much to Jeanne and Shannon, and congratulations on your incredible work, and I guess commiserations to the system that has been built to serve our interests, all of us, I suppose. So I would appreciate if you turned on your cameras and raised your hands if you'd like to ask a question. And perhaps while we're waiting for raised hands, I do have a question for you to kick off the discussion. So, recent changes at the FDA and Vinay Prasad ending up at the FDA. I very much admired his work on oncology. And he's done a lot of good, I think, for the field of oncology in terms of eye-opening. What are your thoughts? Do you think what is likely to happen? Vinay getting into the revolving door game or changing the FDA?
Shannon, I think we ought to leave that for our next. It's hard to discuss it because we have two articles, one for the BMJ and one for the Lever coming up, where we go into detail about this. But we will say this much: we think it's very unfortunate that a lot of people have come to distrust the FDA for good reason. And Kaiser Family did a poll, and what they found is that part of the reason, some of the main reasons that people distrust the FDA is because of their concerns about big pharma. They really are suspicious of big pharma. And so what we see as an industry is, you know, Shannon just outlined, totally captured by big pharma. And had we addressed that, maybe we wouldn't see people thinking that the best next step is to just destroy the agency. And unfortunately, what Prasad and McCary can do under this current circumstances, we have some hard data that we're going to go over when we write our articles, but we don't think it's looking good.
And just a hint, this is these are statutes. So, you know, the FDA works under a set of statutes, and Congress is the one that passes the laws. And so no matter who is at the FDA, there's a certain amount that can be done, and there's a certain amount that cannot be done by commissioners and heads of divisions.
I think another thing we could say perhaps, but Shannon just shut me up if I'm going too far, is that it's typical of Trump to hire people who are at each other's throats. That's what he likes, that's what he does. And so we're seeing people with completely different values in terms of what they want to do at FDA. And if they do something that Trump doesn't like, they're going to be out like Elon Musk is out. So we'll see.
And it's hard to imagine that slashing the workforce by nearly 20% is actually going to lead to faster approvals, as Martin McCary has promised, the new commissioner. And it's also hard to see how you don't lose a lot of other people with a lot of expertise who leave because they're worried their jobs are going to be next. The FDA is pretty dispirited right now.
Thank you. Well, now AI is going to be making all the decisions. So
oh yeah, that's great. That
will solve everything.
Confidence. Absolutely feel good about that. Charlie,
please go ahead.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One is related to Avastin. When the a worker for Avastin for Genentech reported his company for hiding the side effects, the Department of Justice filed an amicus in support of that worker, and the courts ruled that worker could not sue Genentech because hiding side effects was not illegal according to them, because there was no contract involved. We filed a similar we filed a similar lawsuit. We had a similar amicus, and we got a similar ruling that they cannot sue the FDA unless you have a contractual violation and not a safety violation.
Unbelievable. I was unaware of that. Charles, can you send us a link to something that'll tell us about that? Or did you already put it in the chat? That'd be great. Related to that, I want to mention one of my favorite things about the reverse revolving door at FDA is when people from industry go to FDA just long enough to change the rules in a way that will favor industry and then go back to industry. My favorite story about that is Dan Troy, who was an attorney for drug companies and previously for, I think, also the tobacco industry. I'm not sure, but he was definitely an industry guy, industry lawyer. When he went to FDA, he wrote an amicus brief for the FDA to say that people should not be allowed to sue a drug maker if the drug was approved by the FDA, because that was all the proof you needed. Now, the prior lawyer for FDA had said it's a really important tool to help us recognize when things go wrong, and we need people to have the right to sue drug makers. But preemption became the rule because of Dan Troy, and then he went back to industry.
Well, he went back to the law firm that works
for
does
industry.
regular work
Yeah.
for the industry. Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
point.
Thank you, Peter.
Hi, guys. Thank you.
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Peter.
Great to see you and hear you, and congratulations. I'm now on the board of, proudly on the board of Consilium Scientific, so I'm expanding my interest a little bit out of the field that I as you work in Alzheimer's disease. But here's my question. This problem is a caricature, an exaggeration of things that are going on in our culture at large. Call it neoliberalism, call it what you want. This focus on individual health, this focus on unbridled capitalism. And I've often had the fantasy that if people wake up about things like climate change in the health domain, perhaps their own personal health and community health will be a factor to influence their thinking about a lot of other things. Not only the crisis that you're dealing with, but the crisis of crises. I think the media bears some responsibility as being part of this, because as I read the mainstream media, even the responsible mainstream media like New York Times, I don't see them seeing this deeper problem. So I guess this is a hard question to ask, but you're the right people who've been thinking about it. What is the relationship, in your opinion, about the issues that you're talking about here and larger cultural issues? And does that give us any clue about how we might actually improve the situation in health or in culture more generally? Thank you.
Well, deep question. So I can say something that's sort of small bore here, which is that one of the things that happened when PDUFA was passed was that it was the beginning of a period, not just of deregulation, but of a shift in the way people think about their relationship to government. So Congress, many members of Congress did not want to pass the user fee law, PDUFA, because they were concerned that it would compromise the integrity and the independence of the agency. And at the time, David Kessler was the commissioner, and he supported PDUFA because he was desperate to get funding for his agency. And so he supported PDUFA, and he bent over backwards to say, this does not mean we're going to lower our scientific standards. This does not mean that we're going to have a compromised agency. Because at that time, it was quite well recognized that one of the reasons that you have regulatory agencies is in order to ensure that capitalism, that profit seeking, does not run roughshod over ordinary people. And that was taken as a given. But one of the things that was happening was this movement, this sort of free market movement, which neoliberalism has certainly embraced in so many ways, which says that that government and industry should be partners, that we can increase the well-being of the society by increasing the wealth of the society, and that government should be helping business, not protecting people from any businesses that become rapacious. And so there was this real shift in the way people thought about what government's job is and what its role is in terms of protecting consumers. And so now, fast forward 30 years later, and we have a lot of what we have today, in part because of that shift in thinking. And how can we shift thinking back to this idea that, in fact, government does have a role to play in controlling capitalism and sort of finding ways to ensure that markets work yes, for business, certainly for business, but also for the population as a whole. And I think it's starting to happen, but I don't know if it's happening fast enough. I think the fact that people are in terms of the FDA and pharma, the fact that people are very distrustful of pharma is a legitimate distrust. The fact that they're distrustful of the FDA is more problematic because it's sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's just destroy the FDA because it's a corrupt agency. It's part of the deep state, et cetera, which is what Robert Kennedy is saying in response to somebody's question on the chat, that Robert Kennedy is basically saying this is a terrible agency, this is a corrupt agency, this is a deep state agency, and we just have to sort of wipe the slate clean and start all over again. So I don't know how that translates into larger issues like the big existential one that's facing us, which is climate change. But there is this small shift that's happening in terms of people's sort of perception of what corporations are doing and what kind of controls need to be placed on capitalism. I don't know that that's very satisfying.
Well, I hope you're right. I look for points of leverage, and I think Alzheimer's, because of all the money, all the fear, all the hype, if it collapses, which it may be heading towards, particularly with the lay organizations leading the way to collapse because of their misrepresentation of things, then maybe one field like that will create this growing regulatory capture more generally. But anyway, I'm not a panelist, so I shouldn't be speaking, but thank you for your comments, Shannon. It's a tough one.
Thank you for these comments. I think you took the view of the FDA, which is probably the brand in terms of market approval for the rest of the world. Not every country has agencies. Very few countries actually have agencies with such capacities. However, how much role do you think FDA plays on setting the trend for the rest of the world? Because it's not like the drugs from your list are not available in Europe. There is a little bit of a discrepancy, of course. There are some drugs that are approved by the EMA, which are not actually approved by the FDA, and vice versa. I'm sure there is a bit of discrepancy with Health Canada or maybe Japan or Australia, but in general, the biggest bulk of drugs are on all global markets. And of course, developing world is a separate story. How much do you think FDA plays this trendsetter role?
Well,
And
it
if
used to be the trendsetter, and there were a lot of countries that simply said, you know, if FDA approves it, that's written into their laws, then we approve it, our agency approves it. But increasingly, we're finding that other countries are getting less and less respectful of FDA's decisions. And Health Canada is a good example. I forget the numbers, but they looked at, somebody assessed all the cancer drugs approved by FDA versus Health Canada, and they rejected quite a few cancer drugs that the US accepted. And similarly, we're seeing, like with the Alzheimer's drugs, a number of countries turned down in one way or another. So for example, EMA turned down Lecanemab. I think they're revisiting that now, I'm not sure. But their initial turn down was different than our acceptance. And then NICE said we won't pay for it, but it can be on the market if private doctors want to prescribe it. So there was a limitation and a recognition. And I think same thing with Consilium got turned down. Australia turned down, and Canada just hasn't ruled on one or two of them. But there's much less acceptance of those drugs compared to in the US. And so I think,
but you're, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jeannie.
well, I just think that one good thing to do is to compare other countries with what we're doing. And I think that's a starting point to say why, you know, why do we have these drugs that then have to be withdrawn that other countries refused?
But I think increasingly, the EMA, for one, are actually starting to take money from the industry. And so it's the beginning of that kind of a shift in the relationship between the industry and the regulatory body.
Well, there was that.
But we did talk to, we did talk to some middle income countries, to researchers from middle income countries who said,
Latin
we're
America.
starting to doubt what the FDA does.
Yeah, there was a great investigation by BMJ recently where they looked at Brilinta, and they found that the only reason it passed muster is because it did extremely well in the European countries. And the studies that came out of the US, these were all different sites that did the same study. In the United States did very poorly. And when they looked at it, the European countries were monitored. Apparently the monitoring that was done of those sites was done by AstraZeneca, whereas in the US it was independent sites. And it's things like that that we need to get people to pay attention to and say, we need independent funding. We need to get FDA, we need to get pharma out of FDA. We got to stop PDUFA and pay public funds to do something for the public.
Yeah, there was a comment from Andrew Dillon in the chat about positive experience of actually collaborating with industry at NICE. And actually, in an ideal world, I guess this is what it should be. The problem is we don't live in an ideal world, and incentives are extremely skewed and profits come above all. And I've noticed that pharma is actually lovely to speak with when they have a good drug that works, and there are some good drugs that do work.
Yeah, of
and
course.
everyone is so lovely and so much on the same page. The problem is it's an exception rather than the rule. And the rule becomes very sad because the marketing department has their own agenda, and basically the industry very quickly changes from collaborative and supportive and finding a way forward towards we need to get it there at any cost because there's so much on the line. First, and above all, is the shareholder value. And
and the sad thing about these negative outcomes is that it contaminates the field. So we don't know when the good ones come out, are they really good? Can we trust it? And that's where I think getting industry funding out could make a difference. We'd be a little more trusting.
The problem is deeply fundamental. So it's there are definitely exceptions to this not very pleasant world that we're observing. But yes, unfortunately, the deeply flawed system results in what we're experiencing at the moment. And I really appreciated Peter's view. But the problem is, once again, this is also a problem of human nature and net present value, that we just simply value a lot more what we have now rather than investing in the future and thinking that this would be of value in the future. So, and that's also a huge problem. So especially in the corporate world. All right. I very much appreciate this discussion. Thank you so much for your work. You opened a box of, well, not you opened the box of Pandora, you look deeply into that box one more time. There is a lot more to be found there. So thank you for this risky and important work, and pleasure to work with you. And thank you so much for preferring our seminar to Wimbledon semifinals. That means a lot to us. If you still have the chance, you can catch a glimpse of the last balls. All right. In any case, we'll see you in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks for our last seminar before we break for the summer, and then we'll come back in September. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.